Hi, David Vizard here, and you, my friends, are watching PowerTec 10. This, if I need to remind you, is the channel that does not tolerate BS, poor products, or anything else that may impede your search for performance. Our policy here is, if it's good, promote the heck out of it. If it's mediocre, for the most part, ignore it. If it's poor product or BS, expose it. Now, we try not to do too many negative ones. I think out of the near 100 we've done so far, we've only done 3 that are, how shall I say, have deep negative criticisms of whatever it is we're talking about. Now, in this video, I am going to be slightly critical, but it is only slightly critical. And what are we talking about? Well, we're going to talk about the world's most effective octane booster. And here's the good news. It's dirt cheap. So let's have at it. What is this episode 95 going to be about? Water injection. Now, you could be fooled into thinking there cannot possibly be too much to the science of water injection and how to use it. Well, you'd be wrong. But here's the surprising thing. Bearing in mind how effective it can be at solving so many problems, there isn't that much written about it. What is written is okay to a point, and this is my gripe here, another gripe article. None of these presentations that I've seen, and they may be out there, will give a really good picture of what water injection can do and how it does it. Now, there was a lot of work done on water injection just before World War II and during World War II, because it avoided, or it pushed back the limitations of supercharged engines. What limitations were these? Detonation caused by the exhaust valves getting too hot. This is one of the reasons why the Merlin engine had 4 valves, 2 exhaust valves instead of 1, because 2 valves for the same area have greater ability to get rid of heat, because the center of the valve for a given valve area is always nearer the edge, so it conducts the heat away faster. So a 4 valve engine can take more boost before detonation sets in. It's not much, but it's a help. And during World War II, everything was important. Now, where's all that information gone? It's out there somewhere, but you know what? If you try finding it, you could be in for some, how shall I say, painstaking searches. I spent probably a day just trying to find some definitive work that NASA had done, or NACA as it was known then, National Aeronautic and something or other association. I can't remember what the C stands for. Brain surge. But anyway, it's not easy to find. So I'm going to help you guys out here by giving you a much simplified, how shall I say, a much simplified but technically in-depth look at water injection and how to make it work. Now, what we've got to do first is look at combustion and see how that plays into the game here. Now, one of the things I want to start with here is, do you know the difference between an internal combustion engine and an external combustion engine? Can any of you think of an external combustion engine? you should do. It's a fairly common type of engine. It's called a steam engine. Now then, the reason I bring this up is because I want to focus on something called the working medium. This is something which you have very rarely mentioned, but it relates to what we're doing in a very significant manner if you are to understand the processes involved here. First off, let's look at a steam engine because this is easier to see what I'm getting at. The working medium is water. The combustion process is outside of the expansion cylinder, right? It's a boiler. You throw wood, coal, oil, whatever on it to burn, to heat the water, which is the working medium. Hot water, heat, steam, high pressure, pushes a piston back and forth. Now let's look at a regular internal combustion engine. Working medium, air. Fuel, gasoline. It's burned in the air, and the object of the exercise is to heat the air up so that it expands. And by the way, the mixture does not explode when the spark plug goes off. It burns. It is definitely a burn, and it burns across the cylinder at probably less than 200 miles an hour. I could actually work that out, but I'm not going to now. Take my word for it. It's less than 200 miles. When a cup car goes by you on Charlotte Speedway, the car is going faster than the flame front in the cylinder. That'll give you an idea of how fast it burns. Now, what's an explosion then? An explosion, I believe, the definition of explosion is something which burns at a rate of at least 1,000 miles an hour. I think the threshold, stumbled with that word, is 2,000 miles an hour. That's an explosion. We are so far from that in the cylinder, it's unreal. So, the cylinder, gas and air does not explode. And it's not an explosion pushing the piston down. It is the real definition of it is that it's the air pressure increasing and forcing the piston down. The temperature of the cylinder gets to about 2,000 degrees. Now then, if we inject water into the cylinder, the working medium becomes water and air, right? Because now you may say, well, won't the water put the flame out? No, it doesn't. It is very hard to put the flame out when the water is in droplet form and not flooding the cylinder. You have to put in so much water to put the flame out in a internal combustion engine that it probably hydraulic it. You can put in as much as 3 times more water than fuel and still run. Now then, what about cooling the charge off? Well, it does that, but that is not its main advantage. Think about this. How many octane is water? What compression ratio would you have to use to make a water charge detonate? It's off the scale. We might as well consider the octane rating of water to be infinite, because it almost is. It's not until it gets to pressures that cause the dissociation of the molecules and the atoms of gas in it, hydrogen and oxygen, that it becomes not water. At that dissociation, it can recombine in a combustive manner, but we are so far from that, we're getting into the realm of nuclear physics. Now, let's look at this in a little more detail here. How much water can we inject in? Way more than we will ever need to make our octane value equal to some, and this is subjective rather than objective, equal to a gasoline of 250 plus octane. But here's the advantage. It lowers the combustion temperature. So, it stops parts melting. It cools the cylinder off enough that your pistons are about 50% stronger because they're reduced in temperature. The steam in it scours the combustion chamber and pistons so they stay cleaner, and you can up the boost and give the engine mean best torque timing. That is, not the best timing for the best torque number at one point, but the best power curve, so at every point you check the power, you can give that engine the advance that it requires for best torque. So you plot out the curve. You'll test it at 1,000 RPM at full throttle, 1,500, 2,000, 2,000, and so on. And at each point you'll put down what the timing it needed for best torque. And you make a curve, and you make the ignition curve to that curve. Now, let's look and see what happens when we inject water and do nothing else. Let's look at how and why water can be effective. First, you'll see tests done whereby people just inject the water, like into a turbo or into the engine, and they say, well, that didn't work, the power went down. Well, yes, it did, and that's to be expected for one or two reasons. The first is the ignition timing may need to be different. Because it's a cooler charge, most often you have to advance the ignition slightly, a couple of degrees usually. But secondly, it now contravenes the reason a rich mixture delivers extra power. Let's forget about the water for a moment. When you're trying to get the mixture to make the most power occurs when the mixture is on the rich side. Now, typically, the correct mixture for air and fuel, so that they both combine and burn and there's no oxygen left and no fuel left, they've all combined chemically to produce the exhaust gases. That's about 14 point something to 1, I forget the exact number, right? But so what happens to the extra fuel? Well, in a way, it works like water injection. It helps to do two things. One, it helps cool the charge, and two, it makes sure that there is always fuel by any molecules of oxygen, more or less. So the combustion process is easier because the combination of fuel and air is such that it is the most ignitable at that. So what you're using as a working medium is fuel and air. In the same way, that rich mixture is there, it doesn't burn, it helps cool the charge, and it helps cut detonation. But it's not super good at that. It does work, but you're paying for it. Now, I want to make a point here. A lot of air-cooled aircraft engines run richer mixtures because it's easier to make the engine run cooler by putting in more fuel than it is to carry a lot of water and put in. So that's a point there. Sometimes you'll get aircraft engines run pretty rich mixtures, and it's there to cool the engine. When they say these engines are air-cooled, not quite true. They're air and fuel cooled. We don't need to worry about weight so much on a car, nor do we have to worry about that in water injection lasting 5-6 hours continuously. We only need boost the octane of the fuel when it's required, and it's never required at light loads and part throttle. So there's no point in doing it. So we raise the octane value of the fuel only when it's needed, and then when we do so, we have to back out of the fuel because we do not need as much fuel going into the engine. If we do that, then we find that when we inject the water, the power does not drop, but we're using less fuel. Now, if the fuel's not very good, when the water is injected and the fuel is leaned out to be more like 14 to 1, maybe 14.5, instead of 13 or 12.8, then we find that the fuel and water adjustments combined will slightly increase the power. But we haven't reached the end of it yet. If we've got a normally aspirated engine, we could build an engine with a very high compression. And that means good torque, and more so to the point, good fuel economy. Your fuel economy is, assuming everything else is right, your fuel economy is almost totally dependent on the compression ratio, or to be more exact, the expansion ratio. That's the other side of the coin to the compression ratio. Now, what we have here is, let's say we've got an 87 octane engine and it detonates it 10 to 1. Well, what we could do is run a 14 to 1 compression and put water in. Now that's where it really pays off, because you'll lose a slight bit of power because you're injecting water, but you'll gain a whole bunch of power because the compression ratio has gone up so much. Now, you don't need to have water injection at part throttle. So now, at part throttle, you're running a 14 to 1 compression / expansion ratio, which means your mileage should, if you've got everything else set right, climb substantially. You want to build that 32, 33 mile per gallon V8, 14 to 1 compression. You could go to 16 to 1, have that water injection on, but 14 to 1 is very doable. So that's one aspect. The next aspect, and more to the point with what I'm doing with my Mustang, I'm pointing to that baby over there, is that it will allow me to make the fuel and water combination whatever octane I want for the boost that I want to use. In other words, I could make that Mustang run 40 pounds of boost on 87 octane. Sound unrealistic? No. With my friend Al in Turbo Techniques in California, Riverside. I'll put the name across the bottom here. We ran as much as 45 pounds of boost on 87 octane fuel. A Chevy engine, single turbo, made about 1,000 horsepower at the rear wheels with well over 1,000 foot-pounds of torque. Right? This thing ran like it was a Saturn V on wheels. I mean, well, our best quarter mile time with it was 8.6, and that was 20 years ago. No, 20, nearly 30 years ago now. So it's fast. 8.6, and I think it ran 160, high 160s in the lights. And that wasn't a race car. That was deadly quiet, 4-speaker stereo, telephone, and when we did that pass, it had the groceries in the back. Been shopping with it. So, for a performance like that, that water worked very well. Now then, you say, what about water methanol injection? The extra methanol's fuel. No, you don't. Actually, the only reason that you need methanol is to stop the water freezing, right? And here's the other thing. Putting the methanol in there also cuts the likelihood of rust in the system. But the best thing is to put a little drop of soluble oil in, maybe 2%. That will lubricate everything in the system and the cylinders. In theory, you don't need methanol. You can put it in, it's easier to tune, but here's the problem with a injected engine like the Mustang, you put methanol in there and it will back the fuel out because it sees the methanol as fuel. Now if we just put water in, it doesn't see the water as fuel. So tuning the engine is much easier. Here's my take on this. If you want to get water to work in your engine, you can't, it's a domino effect. You cannot just squirt water in. It's not that simple. You have to put in enough water to suppress detonation. Then you must adjust the timing and mixture to suit that water injection. Also, to take full advantage of it, up the boost. Now, when I was developing a turbo motor for Chrysler, I had no idea how much it could take on stock fuel detonation. This, I'm going back now to 1972, 73, right when the bad fuel started to rear its ugly head. And one of the things I found was you could do anything you wanted if you had water injection on there. Now mostly I used water injection with a bit of soluble oil in it, no methanol. We managed to, well, we made 300 rear wheel horsepower on pump gas, basic octane, whatever that was back then. I think it was 87 octane, and about 30 pounds of boost from a 1600cc engine. It was the simplest turbo engine you can imagine. No wastegate. Well, I controlled the boost with a specially designed washer in the exhaust, right? So it was a 10-cent wastegate or boost limiter. The longest part of my development was getting the power curve to look like it was normally aspirated and turn over at the top. That was one of the things they wanted. And that, with turbo sizing the shape of my, in quotes, wastegate and the camshaft, and a few other things, that came about. How good was it? Oh my God, that car went like a scalded cat. On a wet track, just using third gear only at Santa Pod, it ran a 13.1 at something like 108 miles an hour. But we had to start in third gear because the other two gears in the wet were useless. Now, were we on slicks? Hell no. We had Dunlop Rally Specials. And they were designed to be good in the wet. Still, wheel spin was a problem, and my crew chief who drove the car had to totally concentrate on not breaking the tires loose. And anyway, after that run, he got an applaud. Now, why were we running the car in the wet? Well, it's the only chance we had. It was our tow car. Here's the irony here. The tow car was faster than the race car. But anyway, let's move on. Let's look at some of the requirements of water injection to make it optimal. Very often I've seen in videos on water injection and tests where the water is, I'm going to exaggerate a little here, but it's almost like pouring it in out of a bucket. The truth of the matter is there's more to it than that. Water and water methanol injection has to be a fine enough spray so that it, when it goes into the engine, it's small enough to evaporate very quickly at the point of combustion, but not to evaporate in the system. So if you have too fine a droplets, they'll evaporate and take up room, and that will decrease power. Detonation resistance will go up, and if you run a lean mixture and with water injection very finely done, you can run a very lean mixture and get extremely good economy running a huge compression ratio. When I say good economy, I'm talking about really good. You got a 1 liter engine, and you like what was that little 3-cylinder engine that Chevy put out many years ago? there was the Chevy Sprint, and then there was the little 3-cylinder sedan that was, I can't remember the name of it, but it was 3/4 of a Suzuki Swift engine, right? Single overhead cam, near on bulletproof engine. That engine there, with suitable water injection, could have been a 100-mile-per-gallon vehicle without compromising its performance. In fact, we could step up its performance and step up the mileage. Now, I'll just give you an instance of how this would be possible. First off, we're going to use the water truly as a working medium. We are going to get rid of the radiator, and instead of firing the cylinder every time, we're going to, that's in a 4-cycle thing, instead of firing it every second revolution, we're going to fire it every 4th revolution. Now, this is how it works. Remember, the engine's got no radiator. So what we do is we inject water into the charge so that we can use a 17-18 to 1 compression, a diesel compression. That water prevents the gasoline detonating. On the next power cycle, we just inject water and it absorbs the heat in the cylinder, turns to steam, and we get a power stroke from it. We haven't used any fuel. So we can use the heat of combustion to its extreme. We don't throw it away in the radiator, and on that second stroke, we don't throw much of it away in the exhaust stroke. Think about that. We could now I did some calculations, and we can make a gasoline engine with a brake-specific fuel consumption of better than 0.28. Now you guys who understand that stuff, think about that, 0.28. Think if you had a piston-engined aircraft engine that worked on this, right? Running a super high compression, it didn't need much in the way of air cooling because it was liquid cooled by the liquid intake that it did. We could have a more streamlined plane and have extreme range. Yes, even something like a Cessna 180 could fly probably as much as 1,500 mile range on its current fuel tank. But anyway, let's go back and say, what about the evaporative cooling? Now here is where we get a major bullshit statement from almost everybody. It also applies to the, in quotes, evaporative cooling of nitrous in an engine. They say, well, not only do you get the nitrous, but you get the effect cooling from the nitrous as well. No, you don't. It looks like you do, but here's what happens. The point of cooling off the charge is to have a denser charge of oxygen go in the engine. Now let's use the nitrous as an example here. When you inject nitrous and cool the charge off, the atmospheric part of the charge gets smaller, but the nitrous part of the charge gets bigger. You turn a drop of nitrous this big into a bunch of gas this big. So your volumetric efficiency barely changes. Now, many years ago, NOS did some experiments with a university, and they found that cooling the charge with nitrous, when they checked everything out and got everything balanced, did not result in any more power from charge cooling, only from the extra oxygen that went in with the nitrous. I could have told them this before they started all that testing. So the same thing happens with water. If we have too fine droplets of water, it will evaporate. Sure, it will cool the charge will get denser, but the water will expand and get less dense. It will become vapor. So our cooling is not via the evaporation of the charge, it is via the fact that you have a denser working mass with a much higher specific heat. So it is like throwing water into the cylinder to cool it off. It is the fact that the water is there. Now, if you can get that water to turn to steam or vaporize at the right point, you can now create a power stroke with it, just as I've said. Inject water into a hot cylinder, no fuel, suck the heat out, turn that heat into expanding steam, water vapor and air, and you've got something going for you. Now, what is the optimum size of droplet so that we get the benefits of the water injection, but we don't tamper too much with how much of it is vaporized and takes up space? Well, unfortunately, it varies. The cooler the engine runs initially, the smaller that droplet size need be. If the engine runs very hot, that droplet size can be bigger. In fact, it needs to be bigger because we don't want it to evaporate as fast. Now, you're beginning to see that droplet size is now an important factor, and so it is. So when you're going to buy a water injection system, look into that. Now, I saw a video the other day, and I'll put the name across the bottom. In fact, I'll show some breaks out of it, that they were demonstrating a new nozzle which looked like it vaporized very well. Now, I have a water injection system here. It's got its own standalone computer and it works like a fuel injection, and it sends out a fog of water. It comes out of the nozzle at over 200 miles an hour, and the droplets are almost like smoke. They're less than 10 microns. And what happens is they slow down so quickly that it might be 200 miles an hour at my finger here. That far away, it's about 5 miles an hour. So this droplet is so small that when it comes out, the air looks like it's molasses. That's because the Reynolds number of that droplet is so high. So let's see what I can do to, how should I say, put you in the right ballpark for domestically bred water injection systems. Now, because of the application I've got, I'm tending to go with the one I can't remember at the moment across the bottom of the screen. Now, what about the methanol? Does the methanol boost the power? Not really. The bottom line is the methanol is only there if you want to add fuel to an extra boost. For instance, the injection system on the World War II Corsairs and Thunderbolts. When the water injection went on, it did so when they went into war emergency boost, and it allowed enough extra boost that the engine developed another 500 horsepower. The methanol was there as fuel. Also, the methanol was there to stop the damn stuff freezing at 40,000 feet, which it would have done. So the methanol is acting as an antifreeze, and in the first instance, and a fuel in the second. Now, this kind of power was used at takeoff and war emergency. Now, a Thunderbolt used to take off with could take off with a bomb load almost as big as a B-17. Right? Why they didn't use more of them, I don't know, because they could drop that bomb and escape because they were fast enough. I mean, when they say Thunderbolt, it was. It was an aircraft that really needed more recognition than it got. I'm afraid the P-51 stole all that, but the P-51, I don't want to denigrate its importance. Fantastic airplane, beautiful airplane, fast airplane. But the Thunderbolt did have some advantage. It was very difficult to shoot down, and it was the fastest diving aircraft of World War II, so it could escape almost anything. I think even an ME-262 in a dive had a problem catching it, but that's another story. Anyway, so what have we got with the fuel injection? Well, here's what we've got. If you've got a turbo motor, probably the best place to inject it is right before the turbine. Now, if the water droplets are too big, it will cause water erosion on the turbine. If you've got the water droplets the right size, the turbine will last indefinitely. Now, this means you'll have to take note of how much it is, how much the droplet size is. Now, on my Mustang, I expect when I'm putting in about half the amount of water that I am fuel, that it will run 35 pounds of boost on 87 octane fuel, as if I'm putting in race gas. That's cheap to run. The other thing is water is very good at keeping combustion chambers clean. And these direct injected engines are notorious for getting dirty chambers and dirty valves as a result. Now then, you can put an additive into the water, and I'll check that out and see how that's going to work out. That will clean off the valves. So the problem of having valves clog up and an expensive cylinder head removal, clean the valves and put it all back together, can either be delayed for at least twice as long or even eliminated. So water injection can be an asset in that respect. Now, are there any snags? Yes. If you don't do it right, you will have problems. Steam erosion and water erosion of the intake turbine. Do it right and it will be the makings of your turbo motor. I know somebody's going to ask the question, but isn't it easier to do this with an intercooler? Well, yes, but will an intercooler cool the exhaust valves? No. Will an intercooler keep the intake valves clean? No. Will it clean the chamber? No. Will it raise the octane of the fuel? No. It would just reduce the engine's requirement for octane. Now, what about doing water injection and an intercooler? Match made in heaven. Right, first off, it will stabilize the function of the intercooler. Right, stock Mustang intercooler is adequate for one pass down the drag strip, and then the car sit for at least an hour. With water injection on that car, one pass down the drag strip, idle the engine and squirt in some water with a button. You'll cool everything down. 10 minutes later you can make a pass. If you use a slightly bigger intercooler, you may find that just an intercooler that's still rated as a street intercooler with the water injection will give you running 100% of the time on a road circuit. Depends on how much water you put in, but the potential's there. So, let me pose a question here. Have I interested you in water injection? I should have done. The effects of water injection don't seem to be, how shall I say, fully employed. And I don't believe at this moment that those people who make water injection are fully aware of the potential that it could be if everything is done right, and that is droplet size, distribution, water to fuel ratio, and then tuning the engine with the timing and fuel to suit what it needs with the water. And remember, the water's got to replace pretty much all of the excess fuel you would use for a rich mixture. Instead of having a rich mixture, that extra ratio or two of fuel that you use to cool the charge and light it, now it's water, so you're not paying for it, and it's cleaning the cylinders. Last thing, water injection is brilliant at fixing oxides and nitrogen. If you have water injection on it part throttle, you don't need a cap. It is cleaner. You can keep the temperatures down to the extent that oxides of nitrogen are virtually eliminated at the exhaust pipe. Now, parts per million, they can be improved as well. Not by as much of a factor, but they can be improved. And what else? And CO2 can be reduced because you can reduce the mixture, lean it out. And I think that brings me to the end of my water injection here. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to have comments, but I think I've covered all the things that you need to understand. So, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you on the next video.